listener production.
Hello, happy Monday and welcome to The Briefing. I'm Sasha Barbagat. If you spend any amount of time online, you likely would have been bombarded lately with clips from a little sketch show called Saturday Night Live. It might feel like SNL is unstoppable right now, but during its epic 50-year run, it has faced battles to remain relevant and survive the axe.
20 years ago, there was multiple sketch comedy shows produced in the States, and they were competing with SNL, and SNL is the last one left. And I don't know if it's always going to be that way.
In the second half of this episode, we dive deeper into SNL's recent resurgence, but also ask whether it can survive another few decades. First though, time for the headlines with Chris Spiru on Monday, December 16.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody. 5 members of the Bali Nine have spent their first night in Australia in almost 20 years, and that's after their sudden release from jail in Indonesia.
I've conveyed my personal appreciation to President Prabowo for his act of compassion. The 5 men have been returned to Australia under an arrangement agreed between our two countries.
That was Anthony Albanese confirming yesterday afternoon that Scott Rush, Matthew Norman, Si Yi Chen, Martin Stevens and Michael Chugai had arrived back home. They were members of the notorious Bali Nine, a group of Australians caught trying to smuggle heroin out of Indonesia in 2005 and sentenced to life behind bars. The 2 men considered ringleaders of the plot, Andrew Chan and Mayuran Sukumaran, were executed in 2015. Renee Lawrence was released in 2018 after serving 13 years, while Tan Duc Than Nguyen died of stomach cancer while imprisoned.
So what happened to clear the path for the 5 to return home? This has happened so quickly, Chris. Diplomatic efforts on Australia's part have actually been going on for years, and it wasn't until the election of the new President Prabowo Subianto in March that marked a significant turning point. So on a visit to Indonesia last month, the Home Affairs Minister Tony Burke signed a ministerial agreement with his counterpart to secure their release, with their life sentences commuted on humanitarian grounds and on the condition that they continue their rehabilitation in Australia. And as far as we've been made aware, there is no quid pro quo to this deal. So that means Australia has not been asked to provide a favour or a diplomatic duty in return for the release of these men. So the 5 touched back down on a commercial flight yesterday afternoon. Their location has been kept a secret, and it is understood they're being offered accommodation and further rehabilitation by the federal government. Chris, this is very, very different to what happened when Schapelle Corby was released. Of course, another Australian who was caught smuggling drugs into the country, as she maintains her innocence, but she was found guilty in Indonesia. When she was released, it was and when I say circus, media circus.
No, it's circus.
It was insanity. Like, she had journos, cars, helicopters following her literally from walking out of prison to the airport. The plane was followed. Then when she touched back down, her car was followed. There was every TV screen in the newsroom I was working on was her car being followed down this highway. It was really intense and probably quite scary for her after all that time sheltered in prison in quite awful conditions to then just be the centre of this circus. So really interesting that they've obviously tried to keep this quite under wraps. Also, what was interesting was how Albo was talking about the release yesterday. So he was very, very careful to not describe the men as free. He was instead very clear in his thanks for Indonesia showing compassion. He used the word compassion a lot because, of course, Indonesia has extremely tightly held views on drugs and drug crime and how bad it is. So Australia is really trying to protect our relationship with Indonesia by saying, hey, we see what a big deal this is for you. Thank you so much.
And it's interesting, although this has been such a big process to get him home, a lot of people are crediting it with the initial meeting of Albo with the new president on the sidelines of that APEC summit last month. So it's just, I guess, a bit of a show of how diplomatic effort and relationships can really turn things around. Over to Fiji now, where several Australian tourists are in critical condition with suspected alcohol poisoning. Local health officials say 7 guests staying at the 5-star Warwick Resort on Fiji's Coral Coast fell ill on Saturday night after drinking a cocktail at the resort's bar. According to local health officials, the group, which consisted of 4 Australians, an American and 2 foreigners who live on the island, were taken to a nearby hospital with nausea, vomiting and neurological symptoms. It is understood 2 Australian women, a 56-year-old and 19-year-old, were transferred to another hospital due to the severity of their conditions. Australian media is also reporting 2 other Australian women, a 49-year-old and an 18-year-old, remain in a critical condition but not as serious as the other 2 women. Fiji police and local health inspectors are investigating the incident, while DFAT has confirmed it is providing consular assistance to 2 Australian families in the country.
So, of course, this is getting extra attention because of what just happened in Laos. Those 2 girls from Melbourne who tragically died after a suspected methanol poisoning incident at a backpackers. And on the back of this, DFAT has updated its Smart Traveller website with advice for Australians in Fiji, telling tourists to be aware of the potential risks around drink spiking and advising they exercise normal safety precautions. So it hasn't been confirmed how this happened, whether it was a drink spiking incident or methanol or anything, we don't know. But we do know DFAT has confirmed that it is providing assistance to these families. Heatwave warnings have been issued for huge chunks of the country over the coming days, with our hottest December weather expected in 5 years. Queensland has an alert in place until Wednesday. In New South Wales and South Australia, the warning will be in force until tomorrow. A warning for Victoria was cancelled yesterday meantime, but temps will reach 41 degrees today in Melbourne before a late arvo change. So max temperatures across large parts of the interior and east coast are expected to pass 40 degrees over the coming days, while outback maximum temperatures are expected to exceed 45, which is going to threaten a bunch of weather records in those regions. Minimum temperatures, so what it drops down to at night, could sit as high as the late 20s. I even saw the low 30s in some affected areas. I struggle to sleep if it's above 19 degrees, all right? So I hope it's not impacting where I live. Look, this severe heat does follow Australia's warmest spring on record and is likely to be followed by additional bursts of hot weather through Christmas and New Year's. So we can expect a little bit of relief, but it sounds like the hot weather's going to come back.
And Australia's newest pandas have touched down in Adelaide. 4-year-old giant panda Xing Chu and 3-year-old Yi Lan arrived yesterday morning after an 11-hour flight from China. The pair were greeted by near 40-degree temperatures during the day, with China's Consul General to Adelaide assuring they had air conditioning during the flight, and he described the high temps as a significant gesture from heaven to welcome them and to show them warmth. Both pandas will spend the next 4 weeks in quarantine before their public debut in the new year, Sash.
According to the South Australian government, the federal government is going to cover the cost to keep the pandas at Adelaide Zoo, and that is at a cost of $1.5 million a year. But the benefit, they say, comes from the tourism spend, because these 2 pandas, same as their predecessors, were the only giant pandas anywhere in Australia. That is one of the benefits, is the tourism. People want to go see them, but also a stabilisation of the relationship between China and Australia, which is another interesting factor. That's where you hear the term panda diplomacy thrown around. Yeah. Now, this new pair, as I mentioned, replaces the old ones, Wang Wang and Funi, who returned to China after 15 years down under last month. Now, we did cover panda diplomacy because it's really interesting, and we did that in a deep dive in June of this year. Now, if you want to listen to that, we have dropped the episode link in the show notes. And South Australia's Deputy Premier talked about this, about how important these pandas are, mentioning that this is part of strengthening our relationship with China. And, you know, we saw when China slapped all those tariffs on Australian exports, so wine, barley, lobsters, how much that impacted Australia. And so this exchange of pandas is seen as a real turning point in the relationship. Chris, thank you so much for joining us for the headlines today. Next up, we are getting into our deep dive looking at SNL. It's back, baby, but for how long?
Hey, it's Helen Smith here.
A lot of people are saying, Donald, why are you hosting Saturday Night Live? Why? And the answer is, I have really nothing better to do.
Saturday Night Live is currently in its 50th season, a milestone most shows could only dream of. This year, though, it feels like the late night live sketch comedy show is more relevant than ever.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's Charlie Axia.
Chapel Roan.
Ladies and gentlemen, Billie Eilish.
They've got global audiences tuning in via streaming services, and the show's really tapping into the zeitgeist and following online trends, with viral segments like this featuring Ariana Grande taking over our feed.
I can't wait to be his wife. She's pointing to Domingo.
SNL's created stars like Jimmy Fallon, Tina Fay, Will Ferrel, Eddie Murphy. So what does it take to get on the show in 2024? And for those who do make the cut, who and what is really behind the jokes that make it to air? Jon Schneider is the creator and host of Saturday Night Network, a podcast that analyses and breaks down all the best sketches, moments, and jokes of the show. Jon, welcome to The Briefing. SNL seems more relevant than ever this year. Why is that?
Well, SNL is celebrating its 50th anniversary, and a lot of TV shows don't even come close to getting to 50 years. So because of that, there is a lot of people out there who are very excited to celebrate the show turning 50 and reminiscing about their favorite times watching the show. It seems to be a really great time to be a fan of the show.
Over in Australia, we are kind of lapping it up at the moment. I feel like we're seeing more clips on TikTok and social media. Do you think that's also part of this kind of zeitgeist boom we're seeing?
Definitely. I think, one of the ways that the show has changed in the last few years is that there is definitely an increased focus on, going after the new generation, the online audience. Before, it was very important that people were watching, if you were in the States, if you're watching the show on NBC on a Saturday night from 11:30 to 1 a.m., that was how success was measured at the show. Now it's, how many social views are they getting? How many sketches are being talked about online? So it is truly a whole new world for the show. And I'm not surprised to hear that because of that, it's become more of a global show than just a show that attracts to people in North America.
When people think of New York, a lot of people think of, the Statue of Liberty, Times Square, Broadway, and a lot of people think of SNL. How do you think that the show has managed to cement itself in this way?
One of the things about going to New York as a visitor is that it feels like the center of the universe in a way. There's so many cultural landmarks that are there, but, it's a hotspot for things that are happening. So I think that SNL is an imprint or a look at pop culture for every year that it's been on. And when you're in New York and you sort of view SNL as being a very big part of New York City, it's sort of like for all the millions of people that are walking around the city and being interested in the show, it's a way to get a lens into what are the most popular movies, what music is the hottest right now, all of that stuff. So for me, it very much fits with the scene of New York and has transformed that way for 50 years.
We know big names like Jimmy Fallon, Will Ferrel, Tina Fay, Eddie Murphy shot to fame from SNL. Who else got their start on the show?
There's a lot of names that people don't even know were cast on the show. So like Robert Downey Jr., one of the biggest movie stars in the world, was a cast member on the show for one season. But, some of the biggest names out there, Will Ferrel, Kristen Wiig, Bill Hader, a lot of them got their starts on SNL. And that's one of the things that myself, who analyzes and recaps the show, it's one of my favorite things about the show is that you can look at it as sort of like the minor leagues of TV and film, where you get to meet all of these people before they are famous and see them get their starts. And then you'll go and you'll watch them on movies for years.
Does it still create celebs like this, these huge names that we get to know and love? Or does someone have to kind of be someone already to get on the show now?
I don't know that it has to do with the individual person as much as the change in monoculture. When SNL was around for probably the first 35 years, there's no social media, there's no people making themselves celebrities by creating their own content. So because of that, the path to stardom was very clear through SNL. But now, it's much more difficult to be viewed as a celebrity with so many different types of people. You could be very successful on the show and get there. Kate McKinnon was a huge star in the last 15 years on the show, and she left a few years back, and she's definitely a big star now. Bowen Yang has the highest name recognition on the cast right now, and he's still there. So it definitely can happen. I think the path's probably more difficult in 2025, but that's the fun of the show is getting to see it if it does happen or not.
Speaking of influencers, What's the significance of having someone like Trisha Paytas, a YouTuber, making her debut on the show?
This is such a good question because we were asked, this is what we were asking ourselves and talking about all week long when we were doing coverage of the show. What does it mean to have a YouTuber or someone who is mostly recognizable to people who are like perennially online versus, having like the biggest athlete in the world or a major movie star come on? And I think it's the beginning of a big shift at the show in that, they're willing to, go after the online audience and people who may be more niche celebrities. So it's probably a little bit of a risk because you potentially risk alienating an older audience who isn't as familiar with who this person is and why the audience in the studio is going crazy seeing Trisha Paytas in a sketch. But it is a great business decision on the show to continue to be that footprint of pop culture and be ahead of the game, basically, because, Trisha Paytas is now known to many more people after her appearing on SNL than she did before. And SNL is a huge part of that.
So despite SNL really popping off right now, there has been a bunch of times throughout its history that it was rating poorly and could have been axed. What keeps saving them from the chopping block?
SNL is like a wave. Like if you watch all 50 years, it just goes up and down all the time. So what typically saves the show is new young talent coming on and then making the show feel fresh. So I think that, cycle is really important to the show. Laura Michaels, the producer of the show, says that, you connect the most with SNL when you're in high school. And the reason is just that, you're old enough to get it and feel that you can bond over jokes at the show and things you're seeing with your friends, but you're still young enough that it's something that you would want to do, and it's not like you're not like too cool for the show anymore. So like you're like really at the perfect age to watch it, and I had that same experience. So I think that just there's always going to be people out there who will look for something to do at 11:30 on a Saturday night with their friends, and SNL will be there to entertain them.
Yeah, speaking of these younger audiences, they really are tapping into social media trends we're seeing on TikTok and the zeitgeist. Also, the accessibility of SNL now. We're seeing it now on streaming services. Do you think that's also part of its continual rise?
Yeah, I think it's a rise. I also think it's a challenge, right? Because, 20 years ago, there was multiple sketch comedy shows produced in the States, and they were competing with SNL. And SNL is the last one left. And I don't know if it's always going to be that way. Like there may be other streaming services like Netflix that, is putting their foot in the water of live comedy. They just did a Chris Rock special live. They did a UFC fight at the NFL games on Christmas. So like they're venturing into like a lot of live content. And Ted Sarandos is a huge Saturday Night Live fan. And I wouldn't be surprised if in a few years from now, there's a consideration of like, is there going to be another SNL? So I think it's very important for the longevity of the show that they do pursue ventures online and on streaming services so that more people can connect with them. And especially, if you're listening to this conversation in Australia and trying to think about like, how do I access the show? We want that. We want everybody around the world to be able to be interested in it because like funny isn't exclusive to North America. Like you could find the show funny in Australia.
There has been accusations of the show being woke and showing political bias. We just saw the Kamala Harris and Trump election as well. Has that ever had an adverse effect on its ratings or backlash that the show's seen?
Yeah, I think so. When the show first started, they were really seen as rebels. Like back in the 70s, it was Chevy Chase was playing Gerald Ford, and he played him as like a bumbling, like almost like a buffoon who would just like fall and trip and like didn't know what was going on. And that was the like first real portrayal that anybody on SNL ever did of a presidential figure or a major politician. And, that has changed a lot in the last 20 years, maybe 15 years, where, the writing room has gotten really left. Like there's a lot of Democrats that work there. There was a lot of Kamala supporters, and she appeared on the show last month before the election. And, that turned off, I'm sure, people who are Republican, who didn't feel like the show is for them anymore. But what I will say is like, I think the show does teeter back and forth at times. Trump has hosted the show twice. So, they have had other, Republican figures on the show. John McCain's hosted the show before. So, I think that the show maybe leans more left now, but I do think it has a long history. And sometimes people do forget that these things do tend to balance out over time.
We have a lot of comedians on The Briefing, and a topic that often comes up is political correctness and wokeness, killing comedy. Do you think that that's true for SNL? Have we seen that at all?
It's happened for sure. I go back to a couple of examples, even in 2024, where you had Shane Gillis was a former cast member who almost got hired for the show. And he actually got fired before he was even brought onto the show, which is, you could look up what the whole story is there. But basically, he was actually asked to host the show. And it was a very unique experience in the history of bringing back a fired cast member to come and host. And his monologue, I would definitely not describe as PC. Even Bill Burr, who hosted recently after the election, said some stuff in his monologue that a lot of people felt uncomfortable with. But I don't think that SNL is any different than, other, specials that are out there from comedians who are, say things that not everybody agrees with. But I think that's the great thing about Saturday Night Live is that it is just an example of, or a lens into what's happening in the world. I would never want anyone to watch the show and feel like the show is not for them based on their backgrounds or jokes that are being made about, whoever they are as a person. But I do think that SNL not shying away from comics who come on and are willing to go in that direction is a good conversation starter and probably lets other comedians thrive in other venues.
Over the last 50 seasons, what's one of the most iconic moments for you?
For me, it was really the 40th anniversary of the show, which was in February of 2015. To me, this was the biggest night on television, where you had all of these former cast members coming back to the show. You had Jimmy Fallon and Justin Timberlake opening up the show, doing this musical number and inviting all these characters on. We got to see, all these former Weekend Update anchors. Just the audience is just filled with celebrities. And it was just something like this magical night where there's never been anything like it on television before. And as we head towards the 50th anniversary, there's a planned special that I can only imagine is going to be even bigger than the 40th. But for me, that was a night that I think changed my life because I was already a big fan of the show, but I was inspired to go back and watch all of the old seasons and really learn about pop culture and, history from 75 down to 2015 then, which ultimately led me to, cover the show in the way that I do now.
Jon, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thank you so much for having me. I'll come back anytime.
That was Jon Schneider there, host and creator of Saturday Night Network, the podcast. And if you want to check it out, we have the link in our show notes in the description of this episode. You can get it wherever you get your podcasts and also check it out on YouTube. And that's it for this episode of The Briefing. We'd love it if you could share this ep with someone you think might enjoy it as well. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and TikTok and YouTube. Just search for Listener Newsroom. I'm Helen Smith. See you next time.